The U.S. says it shot at and disabled an Iranian-flagged oil tanker attempting to break an American blockade on Iran's ports, warning a siege remains in full effect.
Well, President Trump says, quote, that there is a very good chance of a deal with Tehran after talks between both sides. But he warned that the U.S. will resume bombing at a much higher level and intensity if Iran doesn't agree. Tehran says it's reviewing a U.S. proposal aimed at formally ending the war and would soon convey its response on the one-page memorandum through mediator Pakistan. Well, Omar Rahman is fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He joins us this morning. Thank you so much, Omar. Let's start, obviously, with the latest weeks of a stalemate, but apparently now down to a single-page memo where the entire process has apparently been simplified to first ending the war and then 30 days to resolve the major sticking points like the Straits and nuclear enrichment. So I'm wondering, why has Trump done this, and why is Iran apparently signaling that this might be something it can work with?
First of all, thank you for having me. First, I would be careful about the reporting. I've seen different reporting in different places, and we've kind of seen this song and dance before in terms of one side saying, "Whoa, we're close to a deal," and then nothing ever materializes. Ultimately, I think Trump's at an impasse here, and he really doesn't have a plan forward, and he doesn't even have a process to get to a plan, because he doesn't really rely on the institutions of U.S. governance. He relies on a handful of people who are a bit out of their depth. Real estate developers that are finding this much more difficult than negotiating a building in New York City or a casino in Atlantic City. So I think that's where we're at, and Trump's relying on, Pakistan and other mediators to bridge the gaps with the Iranians. And he responds in real time over social media to whatever he hears. And sometimes that's positive, and sometimes it's negative. Sometimes it's sending the markets in whichever direction. And so I think that's ultimately what we're dealing with here. Whether that reporting that you mentioned is true or not, if it is true, then I think it reflects, maybe a willingness by the U.S. to finally, back down from some of its maximalist demands against the Iranians, which are, I think, the reason we're in this position to begin with.
Okay, so what we know is that Iran is reviewing some sort of a U.S. proposal. We understand the key demands are unaddressed there. With that in mind, how close do you think we are to an actual deal? Do you expect Iran to accept the U.S. proposal as it stands?
Personally, I've been very skeptical that we are close to a deal, especially during the previous round of negotiations. But here at the moment now, and I think we just have to kind of understand the position of the two sides. And that it fundamentally goes back to the JCPOA nuclear agreement from 2015, which Trump pulled out of. So the terms of that agreement essentially become the baseline for Trump. He needs to do better than that, so it doesn't look like he pulled out of that agreement and then has to accept its terms, X amount of years down the road. And so what he tried to do in his first term was apply maximum pressure on the Iranians to get them to come back to the negotiation table and deal better terms with the Americans, and that failed. And so in the second term, what we're seeing is the use of military force to pressure the Iranians, first by allowing the Israelis to do so, and then by the Americans, the U.S. military, joining in. And that has actually backfired spectacularly, because from a strategic standpoint, it actually handed the Iranians leverage they never had during peacetime at the negotiation table. And so now Iran is basically controlling the Strait of Hormuz, and it's coming to the negotiation table much more emboldened and much more empowered and unwilling, I think, to negotiate or to concede on all the terms that Trump is demanding. And so it requires Trump in order to basically compromise on a lot of these principles that he had pulled out of on the nuclear deal, like enrichment and Iran keeping its nuclear program and so forth. And he doesn't want to look like he's been defeated by the Iranians, and he doesn't want to look like this war was a failure. So he's been unwilling to do that so far. Whether he comes and concedes, I think that's the kind of point we're at. And if that reporting is true, it seems like he's willing to make concessions that he wasn't at the beginning of this.
Well, Omar, away from the two main players, France announcing the deployment of the Charles de Gaulle from the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Aden using the Suez Canal. This apparently is a mission to prepare for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Based on what you were saying, you don't think this is a breakthrough? So is this more of a staging maneuver by France and perhaps by the UK as well?
I mean, it's a good question. Again, we saw a month ago Trump putting a lot of pressure on U.S. allies in Europe and even in Asia to come and help free up the Strait of Hormuz. And they were initially unwilling or kind of dragging their feet. So we may be at the point, a month later in which, they have to do something. That may be what we're seeing here. It's hard to say. Again, we could be at the point. The Iranians have also are being squeezed economically by the kind of secondary blockade that the U.S. has imposed on the Strait of Hormuz. And maybe they are willing to, to come to some type of terms. But again, I think it requires concessions on both sides. And just to add a wrinkle, to what I was discussing earlier in terms of what stands in the way of an agreement, there is just, again, a fundamental lack of trust and a lack of credibility on the U.S. side, on Trump's side, because he pulled out of the negotiations in the past and because he used negotiations twice this time around as a smokescreen to carry out military attacks on the Iranians. And so the Iranians, they don't really trust this administration, and they don't want to concede on anything without guarantees in place. But again, that requires a lot of details and mechanisms and hammering out, the contours of an agreement, which I don't think are being done at this moment. Again, what we're seeing in the reporting that you said is that there's a one-page memorandum, a 30-day window in which the other terms are negotiated, both the opening of the Strait of Hormuz during those 30 days and a nuclear agreement. And again, these things take time. The previous nuclear agreement took over a year to negotiate. So I don't see it happening that soon unless they go back to the terms of that old agreement, which would in effect be a failure or defeat for Donald Trump.
Okay. And Oman, with the Trump-Xi summit just a week away, if no deal is secured beforehand with Iran, how would that shape Mr. Trump's negotiating posture with President Xi?
Another good question. I imagine it's going to, figure front and center in those talks between the Chinese leader and the U.S. president. And the Chinese are being affected by this war. We heard comments today from the Chinese government, saying that it's an imperative that an end to the war comes about sooner than later. Again, and also the secondary blockade of the Strait of Hormuz that I mentioned earlier is impacting Chinese ships, which the Iranians were allowing to pass through their blockade to reach China. So I think the squeeze is on more effectively, and I think the Chinese will want to know that the U.S. has some plan in place. And so if Trump goes to that meeting without really a path forward or a clear path forward, I think that will be part of the discussion there and problematic maybe in that discussion.
Omar, I mean, from what I'm reading and hearing, it seems that, it's a question of whether China wants to, put the pressure on Iran. So the question becomes, what is China expecting from this? I mean, not just from, I guess, the countries in the region and in Asia, but also, from the U.S. directly when, she sits down with Trump.
Well, we heard from the Chinese spokesman, I think of a fairly clear backing of the Iranian position, a demand or a hope that this is resolved sooner than later, but an appreciation, let's say, of the Iranian position and I think a willingness by Iran to negotiate in good faith. That's what I heard from the Chinese spokesman. And so, I'm sure, again, they want some type of agreement to materialize here, but I don't know if they're going to push Iranians into an agreement that can't be enforced over time and force a kind of a capitulation here from the Iranian side. I don't see that in the cards. Maybe I'm misreading it.
Okay, Omar, thank you very much for your insight this morning. Omar Rahman, a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs.